Okay, so this demonstration is going to provide details as to how to set up resources to make them visible and requestable in the CADRE front end. My colleague Ryan Perry gave a presentation that's been recorded regarding the background to CADRE and the 5 safes. And one of the developers and my colleague, Mate Mitrev, gave a similar recording on the basic process by which end users can request access to resources in CADRE, and then on the other end, how approvers can approve or reject those requests for access. So I'm going to provide some details, the majority of the details, to set up the resources in the front end of CADRE. So CADRE, the front end is a React front end, and it interfaces with an open source platform called REMS, which is out of Finland. So in order to set up the resources in CADRE, in the CADRE front end, we actually will go into the REMS backend, which is what you're looking at now. So what actually has to happen is that we have to get to the point where we create a catalog item here. So once a catalog item is created and it's enabled, that makes it visible and requestable in the CADRE front end. Now, in order to get to this catalog item creation, we actually have to create a few other components and work from right to left, going from license, workflow, to form, to resource, and then to catalog items. This is all accessible through the administration section of the REMS application. So how does a user actually get access to this administration section? So what has to happen is that an admin user, part of the CADRE team, who is an admin user, would go into the organization section here and would create an organization. You can see that we have a number of test ones written here or created here already. So in this test organization one, I used my a different admin account, and I set the owner of this organization to be this test Gmail account. And that's actually what I'm logged in as right now, using this test cadre 26 Gmail account. So by virtue of being set as the owner of this organization, when I logged in, that gives me access to this administration section. So from there, once I have access to this administration part, then I start creating the different components in order to eventually get to set up a catalog item. So I start from right to left. I start with a license. So I create a license. I select my organization. I'm only allowed to choose an organization of which I've been made an owner. If I was an owner for 4 organizations, I would see 4 choices in here. And that applies to all of the other components as well. So the license type, they're self-explanatory. You can set up an external link. You can set inline text. You can set an attachment. Once you do that, you click save and it's created and will be visible in this list. Next, I go to workflow, and the workflow basically sets up who's going to be specified as the handler or the reviewer/approver of data sharing requests for resources that have been created with this corresponding workflow associated with them. You'll see that later when we get to catalog item. But for now, we're going to create a workflow. So I select my test organization. I set the title of the workflow, taking note of it, so that I can pick it out of the list when I get eventually to catalog items. I usually leave it as a default workflow. And then I set who will be the user that will review and either approve or reject a resource for which this workflow has been associated with it. I'm not going to click on the handlers because it will expose some of our users, and I don't want to do that. I do not set the form here, and I do not set the license here. I just keep it simple. Next, I go to form, and I'll create a form. So the form is basically all the questions that a data owner or data custodian wants an applicant to provide answers to as part of their request. And then those answers can be evaluated to determine whether this user should be approved for access to the data. So to create the form, you select your organization. Again, you give it a name and a title. I usually keep them both the same. And then you can start adding your fields. Now in CADRE, one of the 5 safes is a safe person. So one of the requirements is that the CADRE team wanted to pull the credentials that a user, like an applicant, signs in with, pull the credentials that they've used into the form itself and make those credentials non-editable in the form, so that the approver can have confidence that the person who's applied is who they say they are. So the way that we do that is we can pull the name, the email, and the organization that the user has signed in with from CI Logon, which is the service that CADRE uses for authentication. So for the name field, we can give it the name or the field title of name. And then what we have to do is we have to give it the ID of field name. Well, FLD name. So it has to be exact, and it has to be that. And that's true across every single form. Similarly, for the email, we will call it email. And then we will give it field email as the ID so that CADRE knows to pull the credential from CI Logon. And then for the institution, give it the title of org or institution. And then we go into the additional settings and we give it the ID of field institution. And the CADRE front end will know, because of those IDs, to pull the credentials from a CI Logon and populate these fields with those values and make them non-editable. So then you can add any other field you like, and you can have as many fields as you wish. Hopefully not, hopefully not, something that takes an hour to fill in. So why you want this data, for example, we'll just keep it at that. So once you've created the form and you've provided these field IDs for the name, email, and institution, then you save the form and it makes it available through the list of forms. Once you're finished with that, you come then to resources and you create a resource. And this is a very simple set of metadata. So you choose your organization, and then you have to specify an identifier for this resource. And it has to be unique across all the resources in REMS. Here is where you set the license. So I never set it in workflow. I always set it in the resource. So this is where I would choose the license that I created in step 1, or any other license that I've created previously. Once I create the resource and save it, then I move to catalog item. And this is the final piece that we have to create in order to make it requestable, visible and requestable in the CADRE front end. So to create a catalog item, you select your organization, you set a title, and then you can provide a link, an external link, if your data set or whatever resource you're setting up has, metadata or some other information external to CADRE, you can add that link here. Then I set the workflow that I created in step 2. I add the form that I created in step 3. I add the resource that I created in step 4, and then I click save. Once you click save, you have to then enable it in order to make it visible in the CADRE front end. So once you enable that catalog item, then users will be able to see it and request it in the front end of CADRE. Now, there are just a couple of other things I would like to point out that are handy details. In the workflow, when you create a workflow, I'm not going to click on handlers again because I don't want to expose any users. But one of the choices is an approver bot. So you can set the handler to be an approver bot. Now, what that does is that any resource that would have this workflow with an approver bot set as the handler, whenever an applicant fills in all of the required fields on the associated form, as long as they've answered those required fields and they click submit, as soon as they click submit, then the approver bot approves it. So this means that organizations, if they don't want to evaluate every single data sharing request, they just want the information to be, accessible to them at a later date, then they can use this approver bot to approve the data sharing requests for their resources. For Ada, where I work, the access team has to evaluate every data sharing request in order to determine whether the applicant, based on the responses that they've supplied in the associated form, whether they should be given access to or approved for access to the data. Now, there's about 2% of Ada data sets where the data owner doesn't require that, and they just say, well, just here are the questions we want answered, and as long as they answer those, then they can have access or be approved for access. So in those 2% of cases, then Ada could set up this approver bot. So that's a pretty handy thing for people who don't have the human resources to go through and analyze every request for their data. A second piece of functionality that I'd like to talk about is co-managed groups. Now, I had mentioned before that CADRE uses CI logon as the authentication service for users. Now, another application that comes with CI logon is co-manage, and it provides group functionality. So the way that CADRE leverages this group functionality is that when if an organization wants to leverage groups, when they set up a resource and a catalog item, they would also simultaneously set up a group in co-manage that the name of the group contains the ID that was set for the resource. So when you create the resource, whatever you specify here, if you want to use a co-managed group, then you would create the group with that ID as part of its name. Then what happens is that when a user applies for requests access to this resource, and when they've been approved access request has been approved, the CADRE code looks for a group with the name that contains that resource ID. If it finds a group with that resource ID in it, then the CADRE code adds the approved user to this co-managed group. So this is a handy piece of functionality because an external service that actually provides or facilitates access to the data associated with this resource, that external service can ping the co-managed group and say, give me all the users that have been approved, that are members of this group, because that means they've been approved, right? And then that external service can set up the actual access to the data for all the members of this group. So that's also a handy piece of functionality for an external service to use without having to manually go through and, somebody actually manually facilitate access to the data. You could set up an external service to query who belongs in this group, give them access over here. Dataverse, Ada uses Dataverse as its data dissemination platform. So Ada uses this group functionality, takes it one step further. So the CI logon / co-manage development team actually implemented a plugin with CI logon and co-manage, and it's called a Dataverse provisioner. Now, what that does is when a user is added to a group, and this group is associated with Dataverse, the Dataverse provisioner has a way to figure that out that I won't go into. But when it knows that this co-manage group is associated with Dataverse, then the Dataverse provisioner takes that user that's been added to the group, and then it will add it to the Dataverse group that's been set up alongside at the same time as the co-manage group was created. So it's a handy piece of functionality, an end-to-end piece of functionality for Ada. So when a user requests access to a resource and the access request is approved, the user is added to the co-manage group, and the Dataverse provisioner then adds the user to the corresponding Dataverse group. And when the data sharing agreement that was created by approving the data sharing request, when that approval is revoked or closed, then the user is removed from this group, and the Dataverse provisioner, removes the user from this Dataverse group. So that reverse functionality also applies. So once the user has been set as no longer having access, then it's removed in CADRE, it's removed in the co-manage group, and it's removed in the Dataverse group. Now, an organization doesn't have to use a co-manage group if it doesn't want to. Just don't create a group with the resource ID in the name. Don't create any group. And then there's no group to actually add users to. And this Dataverse group isn't required to be used either, even if you have Dataverse. But it is a handy piece of functionality to manage that access. When the user has been approved and they've been added to co-manage and they've been added to Dataverse, whatever permissions this Dataverse group has been given by the Dataverse manager, then when that user logs into Dataverse, they automatically have access to whatever files that the group has permission to access, to download. So it for Ada, the Ada access management team, they'll only have to approve it in CADRE, and the co-manage and Dataverse provisioning will happen automatically. They don't have to go into each separate thing and assign access to the user. They only have to approve it once in CADRE and revoke once in CADRE. And that end-to-end functionality should work. So that's basically how you set up different things. I've shown you the manual way to create all of these different components in the back end of REMS. You can also do this through programmatically through the REMS API. So if we go back here and I just get rid of that, you can see that all of these Ada resources have been set up, and there are quite a few of them. And the CADRE team and the Ada team did not do that manually. They used the API to create each of those different components in the REMS backend individually, but simultaneously. And also, as part of that code, created the co-manage group and created the corresponding Dataverse group. So that was a small piece of a small Python script just to set all of those different components up. So you don't have to set these up manually. So the API also provides a lot of functionality. I will also mention that we have a documentation website. So it's documentation.cadre.ada.edu.au, and that gives a number of different guides on how to use CADRE and how to set up the different resources. And if you have any questions or need some assistance or would like to try out CADRE, at least the test instance, you can contact the CADRE team at cadre5safes at anu.edu.au. So hopefully this has provided some information as to how to set CADRE up and the back end, to set the CADRE front end and the back end up in order to make your resources requestable. So that's where I'm going to end. Thank you.